Bona tarda.
Bona tarda.
Bona tarda. Bona tarda. Bona tarda.
They are complaining that you don't see you well. So.
Okay.
You can use that.
Yes, yes.
If we speak Catalan.
مرحبتين. أهلين أبنائي. يا هلا. تمام تمام تمام. والله.
Bé, benvolgudes amigues i amics. Funciona el loudspeaker? Bona tarda a tothom. Bé, celebro que els hi hagi semblat una sessió interessant, com perquè en aquests temps en què tothom segueix les coses a distància hagin volgut venir a estar aquí amb nosaltres aquesta tarda. I jo crec que, vaja, estic segur que no se n'arrepentiran gens, perquè jo crec que és una ocasió singular en què tenim un personatge extremadament interessant, que té moltes coses per dir i que a més les diu. Hi ha gent que té moltes coses per dir i se les calla. Però quan tenim algú com el professor Rashid Khalidi, que té moltes coses per dir, que parteix d'una llarga experiència i treball en el camp acadèmic, en el camp del pensament, també en el camp de l'activitat social, política, etc. Jo crec que és una ocasió singular i un privilegi de tenir-lo amb nosaltres. També tenim a la Cristina Mas, que ja és més coneguda i habitual de la casa, però sobretot coneguda en els ambients de Barcelona i més enllà, en el món mundial, com a periodista basada en moltes coses d'aquestes del món àrab i d'Àfrica i d'afers internacionals. Per tenir aquesta sessió, en què jo en faig una mica d'introductor a la sessió, perquè després serà fonamentalment la Cristina el que estableixi aquest diàleg amb el professor Rashid Khalidi. Jo voldria destacar només aquesta qualitat del professor Rashid Khalidi de tenir molt que dir i dir-ho. Si us mireu la seva llista de llibres i publicacions és realment importantíssima i a més ho diu a partir d'un coneixement que jo diria profundament empàtic, és a dir, que ho viu, si em permet ell l'expressió, ja des d'abans de néixer. En el llibre que avui presentem i que espero que tingueu ocasió de llegir i que si el voleu comprar després, doncs ell us el podrà firmar, valgui aquest minut de propaganda que crec que és deguda en aquest cas. Veureu algunes de les claus, jo crec, després ho anirem veient en les seves explicacions, algunes de les claus de tota la seva trajectòria i el seu pensament. Quan ens parla del seu oncle, besavi, que ja com a alcalde de Jerusalem i personatge, per tant, importantíssim a la província palestina de l'Imperi Otomà, el 1880 i pico o cosa així, ja se'n dona compte del que pot arribar a passar i escriu una carta en el Theodor Herzl que acaba de publicar de Judenstaat i diu, escolti'm, que ja hi ha un poble establert i que per tant anem al tanto que no es creïn confusionismes que acabin produint molt de mal a tothom. Vull dir que ja la cosa li ve de família i de molt antic, però després ell realment, jo fa molts anys que per aquests atzars de la vida i de la professió em dedico a toco molt de prop temes de món àrab, etc. I us he de dir que, doncs bé, la lectura dels llibres d'aquest, que he tingut ocasió aquests últims dies a mirar-me una mica de Rashid Khalidi, m'ha semblat fantàstic per la profunditat i la matització de les seves... i al mateix temps radicalitat en el sentit d'anar a l'arrel de les coses, perquè parteix dels orígens. Ara, per començar, ja hem parlat de 1800 i pico com a origen de problemes actuals de Palestina. Bé, jo crec que això és el que podem trobar amb el professor Rashid Khalidi. I bé, la Cristina Mas no cal que la presenti, seria un fallo gros intentar presentar la Cristina Mas a Barcelona, però en fi, tots la llegim cada dia als diaris, sabem de la seva expertesa i només cal obrir cada dia l'Ara per anar a veure què és el que diu la Cristina i sempre té coses interessants que dir. Per tant, jo deixo, no sé en quin ordre voleu que vagi, doncs a la Cristina que condueixi aquest diàleg en el que ja anirem posant cullerades segons convingui i després passaré la paraula a l'audiència quan ja toqui.
Molt bé. Moltes gràcies. Ara agafaré una doble presentació perquè presentaré al públic el doctor Rashid Khalidi, però també intentaré presentar-li al públic el doctor Rashid Khalidi. Penso que serà molt bo aquest diàleg. Sabeu que és un historiador i escriptor nord-americà d'origen palestí-libanès, especialista en Orient Mitjà, és el titular de la càtedra Said d'Estudis Àrabs de la Universitat de Colúmbia, codirector del Journal of Palestine Studies i autor de diversos llibres, molts dels quals no estan traduïts al castellà, i aquest treball que ha fet Capitán Swing és de celebrar que per fi tinguem la seva obra traduïda al castellà. Llibres com Iron Cage, Brokers of Deceit, Sowing Crisis, i aquest treball que presentem avui en la seva edició espanyola es titula Palestina, 100 años de colonialismo y resistencia. El professor Khalidi li vull presentar al públic que tenim avui davant. Tenim també gent que està seguint en streaming la seva intervenció. Et diria que aquí veig en aquest públic com a mínim 2 generacions de palestins que estan a Barcelona. Veig també molts sirians, veig activistes per la causa palestina molt implicants, veig jueus antisionistes i acadèmics. Benvinguts totes i tots i tindreu oportunitat de fer les vostres preguntes i comentaris al professor de seguida. Bé, jo vull començar per confessar-vos que he devorat el llibre en 2 nits. És un llibre que t'atrapa perquè és un llibre que surt una mica de la lògica acadèmica de l'obra del doctor Khalidi i combina, introdueix, el farceix d'històries familiars i personals en un relat en primera persona del que ha vist i el que ha viscut ell, la seva família, els seus avantpassats, i ell personalment molt a prop dels actors palestins i també en els passadissos d'unes negociacions que van ser tan complexes com estèrils. Em sembla que aquest llibre és un instrument important per descolonitzar la mirada que tenim sobre Palestina. I crec que Europa, lamentablement, segueix sent massa còmplice en aquesta mirada colonial encara cap a Palestina. Només per posar-vos un exemple, de fa 2 setmanes vam veure en un vídeo en motiu de l'aniversari de la fundació de l'Estat d'Israel la presidenta de la Comissió Europea, Ursula von der Leyen, que va definir l'Estat d'Israel com una democràcia vibrant en el cor del Pròxim Orient i que va celebrar que els israelians literalment, la cito, literalment fessin florir el desert, amb aquest mite que a Palestina abans de la creació de l'Estat d'Israel era un desert on no valia la pena viure. La tesi del llibre és que El colonialisme britànic, començant l'any 1917 amb la declaració Balfour, va ser l'inici d'una guerra colonial i de colons, aquest settler colonialism, que és tan difícil de traduir al castellà o al català. Aquesta guerra de substitució de la població autòctona contra els palestins, una guerra que es lliura des de fa més de 100 anys amb el suport de les principals potències del planeta. Com explica el seu llibre, el pare del professor Khalidi, palestí de Jerusalem, treballava al Consell de Seguretat de l'ONU i per això ell va néixer a Nova York l'any 48. Abans m'explicava que fa molts pocs dies ha descobert que amb una carta que li va fer arribar una neboda que viu a Ramallah, que els seus pares tenien la intenció de tornar a Palestina quan ell havia de néixer i que entremig va passar la Nakba i aquest retorn va ser impossible. Per tant, tenim aquí un altre fill de la Nakba, encara que ell no la va viure en primera persona. De la Nakba que aquesta setmana estem commemorant el 75 aniversari. El llibre explica molt bé com l'estat d'Israel és resultat de la colonització britànica i d'aquesta declaració Balfour que ell qualifica com la primera declaració de guerra, diu, d'aquesta guerra colonial que ha durat més de 100 anys contra el poble palestí. El llibre s'estructura en aquestes 6 declaracions de guerra que ell va enumerant amb una documentació superinteressant i farcint-la d'aquestes vivències personals i familiars. Aquestes 6 guerres que han facilitat, amb el suport primer de Gran Bretanya i després dels Estats Units, la colonització de Palestina, creant i assegurant l'estat d'Israel, ell la situa l'any 17 amb la declaració Balfour, el 47 amb el pla de partició de l'ONU, el 67 amb la resolució 242 del Consell de Seguretat de l'ONU, el 82 amb la invasió israeliana del Líban i el 93 amb els acords d'Oslo i després amb l'entrada d'Ariel Sharon a l'esplanada de les Mesquites l'any 2000. El que deixa molt clar el llibre és que no es tracta d'un conflicte entre israelians i palestins, sinó d'un projecte colonial estratègic per les grans potències. O dit d'una altra manera, no estem davant només d'un poble oprimit contra un poble que l'oprimeix, sinó d'un projecte estratègic de les grans potències mundials i, per tant, el poble palestí enfronta molt més que no només l'opressió israeliana. Khalidi condueix el lector a través dels llargs i durs anys posteriors al 48, quan Israel i també els estats àrabs veïns pressionen i recargolen el poble palestí. La guerra dels 6 dies, mentre els Estats Units lluitava al Vietnam, el situa com aquest esdeveniment frontissa, aquest turning point que va convertir els Estats Units en el principal aliat d'Israel davant dels règims àrabs recolzats per la Unió Soviètica. També exposa interessants converses entre funcionaris nord-americans i israelians, inclòs un jove Benjamin Netanyahu, davant els quals els Estats Units es plegaven, i explica, també d'una manera molt sincera i divertida, com gairebé per casualitat va acceptar ser assessor de la delegació palestina a les negociacions de Madrid i de Washington entre el 91 i el 93 i explicar des de dins com van ser aquelles negociacions i aquelles converses. Aquest és el relat de com s'ha anat avançant el colonialisme, però també l'entrecreua amb el relat de la resistència palestina. Una resistència que han fet tots els pobles colonitzats al món i que els mateixos sionistes, i això és molt interessant la documentació que ell exposa, els mateixos sionistes ja donaven per descomptat que es produiria quan van engegar el seu projecte. Una resistència explica que no està exempta d'errors, de contradiccions, de lideratges que buscaven la seva supervivència com a aparells per sobre dels interessos del poble que deien representar i també d'uns règims àrabs que deien estar al costat dels palestins quan en realitat feien molt poc per ajudar-los quan no soscavaven la seva lluita. Entre la dècada dels 60 fins al 83 va viure principalment a Beirut, on van néixer els teus 3 fills. El llibre detalla, per exemple, un episodi com al costat del seu germà va veure com l'exèrcit israelià llançava les bengales a la nit per il·luminar les falanges, les milícies de la falange libanesa que massacraven els camps de refugiats de Sabra i Shatila. La resistència palestina va perdurar malgrat tot, i aquí ens porta una idea molt interessant, que és aquesta idea de la llei de les conseqüències imprevistes o no desitjades, i explica aquest moviment de com tota l'expulsió de la direcció palestina i de l'OLP del Líban que va acabar a Tunísia i dispersa entre molts països, al final es va traduir amb un procés autòcton que va començar de manera totalment autònoma en aquesta direcció amb la primera intifada dins dels territoris ocupats. Aquesta idea de com Israel va ressuscitar sense voler la resistència palestina amb les seves accions de mà dura. També és interessant com ens explica la figura d'Arafat i el paper que va jugar, i com el projecte aquest de colonització de Palestina no s'ha aturat. Un testimoni privilegiat, tenim moltes ganes d'escoltar-vos. Gràcies per haver vingut fins aquí, gràcies per aquest llibre, i m'ha demanat que us recordi que teniu el llibre fora i que us el signarà amb molt de gust. Moltes gràcies.
Buona tarda. Good evening, everybody. I want to begin by thanking the Instituto Europeo de la Mediterránea. I can't pronounce Catalan, I'm sorry. Here in Barcelona. I want to thank the Casa Árabe in Madrid, and I want to thank my Spanish publishers, Captain Swing, for hosting me, for bringing me to Spain and bringing me to Catalonia, and organizing this visit. They have all been very generous, and they've given me a very warm welcome. My thanks also to Senan Florenza and to Caterina Mas for participating this evening. I'm going to talk this evening about the Spanish edition of my book, whose title in Spanish you've already heard, Palestina, 100 años de colonialismo y resistencia. The English title is The 100 Years' War on Palestine, a history of settler colonialism and resistance. I want to begin by noting something that Christina mentioned, which is that 2 days ago marked the commemoration of 75 years since the Palestinian Nakba. This was a traumatic event that largely destroyed Palestinian society and that forced more than half of Palestine's Arab population from their homes. They never were allowed to return, and their property was stolen. Thank you. It had an effect on nearly every Palestinian, and the effects of the Nakba are felt until this day, are felt unto the third and fourth generation. I talk in the book about some of the effects of the Nakba on my grandparents and other members of my family, and on other families, other Palestinian families. As Christina mentioned, I was talking to her before. 3 weeks ago, my niece, who lives in Ramallah, my niece Bushra, sent me a copy of a letter, sent me pictures of a letter that my mother wrote in 1946 from New York to my grandparents in Jaffa. And in it, she told them that they were about to be married, and that she wanted to reassure them that she and my father were planning to come back to Palestine, and she wasn't going to keep him in the United States. I never knew this until I saw this letter 3 weeks ago that my niece sent me from Ramallah. Obviously, the Nakba intervened. My father and my mother were never able to return to Palestine. My grandparents were forced to leave their home. They never were able to return. My father continued on with his studies. He was in the United States studying at the time. He continued with his studies at Columbia, where I teach. And I was born in New York as a consequence. So I might have been born in Palestine had they been able to return. And I literally found this out 3 weeks ago when my niece sent me this letter. I think that this book has revealed to me, since it was published in English in January 2020, that there is an enormous interest in Palestine, an enormous and growing interest in Palestine, not only in the English-speaking world. This book has been published now in 14 different editions, in 14 different countries, in 10 different languages. I've never had a book that was published in 14 different editions in 10 different languages. I've never had a book that sold in the tens of thousands of copies. I've written and edited 10 different books. This is the first one that has this kind of reception. And I don't think it is only, or maybe at all, due to whatever merits this book has. It's because there is enormous interest, growing interest, especially among young people, in Palestine, to listen to the Palestinian narrative and to think more objectively about Palestine and Israel. This is very clear in the United States. There's evidence for this in a poll that Gallup did in February of this year. Democrats, Republicans, and independents were asked whether they sympathized more with the Palestinians or with the Israelis. When they ran this same poll in 2016, 23% of Palestinians, 23% of Democrats sympathized more with the Palestinians. 53% sympathized more with Israel. That was in 2016. When they did the poll again and asked the same question, which do you sympathize with more, the Palestinians or the Israelis? 49% of Democrats said they sympathized more with the Palestinians. Only 38% said they sympathized more with the Israelis. This is a seismic shift. This is an earthquake. In 7 years, more Democrats sympathize with the Palestinians than with the Israelis. This is a turnaround of epic proportions. And it reflects what we see on college campuses in the United States every day. I talk in the book about an event that was held to celebrate Israel, at which Golda Meir, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, gave a talk in, I think, 1968. I was an undergraduate at that time. 4 of us protested. There were 1,000 people welcoming Golda Meir and celebrating and waving Israeli flags. 1,000 to 4. Today on American college campuses, campus after campus after campus, when students are asked, do you support that our university divests itself from companies that support the Israeli opposition, divestment wins again and again and again in votes of the entire student body. At Columbia, at Brown University, University of Illinois, universities all across the United States. This is unprecedented. And this is an indication of the interest and the sympathy for Palestine that has developed even in the United States, which is the most important supporter of Israel. I want to talk about why I wrote this book. I wrote the book for 2 main reasons. The first is because, as you probably know, in the United States, in the West, there has been a hegemonic discourse, which is entirely determined by an Israeli narrative. Making the desert bloom, what disgracefully your EU president repeated in congratulating Israel 2 weeks ago. Christina just mentioned it a minute ago. The idea that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, or the idea that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. These Israeli tropes, these Israeli nuggets of misinformation and distortion and libel and slander. Desert? Palestine was a desert? In 1914, Jaffa exported oranges to a value in 2023 pounds sterling of 44 million pounds. You do not export 44 million pounds worth of oranges from Jaffa in 1914 from a desert. It's a disgrace that your president, you Europeans, your president said that, and nobody that I have ever heard of has protested. She should be forced to apologize for saying that. Palestine was not a desert. There was a people there. So it's these kinds of lies that are not simply things that were said in 1920 or 1950 or 1970 that are being said today by American politicians, by European politicians, that I was trying to counter by giving a version of Palestinian history. It's my version. The second reason I wrote it was because I was forced to do this by my son, who is a playwright. My son Ismail said to me, enough with the books for academics, enough history books for other historians. It's time for you to write a book that ordinary readers can read, that tells the story of Palestine from your perspective, and in which you include the stories that you tell us about what your father told you, about what your grandfather and grandmother told you, about what your aunts and uncles told you, about what you've read in their memoirs, about what our grandfather, my wife's grandfather, our great-grandfather, wrote in his newspaper in Jaffa, Palestine. Those things you should put in a book, not more boring history. And he was not the only one member of my family who told me to stop writing boring history and to write a book that people could read, a non-expert general audience could read. So I tried to do that. I hope I succeeded. This is a book that has a rigorous structure. It has a well-developed, I hope, a well-developed argument. I've documented it with archival discoveries. There are 45 pages of footnotes. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can read where I got the documents on which I base what I say, the memoirs that I use, the American government documents, the Israeli government documents, the PLO documents, the documents from my own personal collection when I was involved in Madrid and Washington in the negotiations from 1991 to 1993. But you don't have to read the footnotes. I tried to do something that I had never done before in my career, and it was something that was very hard. Since I was an undergraduate, I was trained to write in a certain way, essentially as a historian for other historians, citing documents and excluding myself rigorously from the narrative. As much as possible, the books that I wrote were impersonal, they were objective, and in this book I deviated from that. My son and others who read it, my wife, my editor, my agent, all gave me a lot of help. I didn't do this all by myself. And so I did something I never did before, which is to relate the stories that I heard from my family and from other families, describing my own experiences and the experiences of my father. My father worked in the United Nations for his entire career. He was in the political and security, what was called the Political and Security Council Affairs Division of the UN Secretariat. So he was an official of the United Nations. He wasn't a diplomat. He worked for the UN. And his job was to sit in the Security Council every time the Middle East was discussed. And he would tell me stories. And sometimes he would say, come to the UN and go to the visitors gallery and sit in the Security Council visitors gallery and watch the proceedings. One chapter, I start by describing what I saw over the whole day of June 5th, 1967, when the Israeli army was occupying Syrian territory. Still occupied to this day, 56 years later. I'd never done that before. I never used my own personal experiences. I described what happened in 1982 when the Israeli attack on Beirut started with bombing of the area that my wife was working in. My wife worked in Wafa, the Palestine news agency at that time. I was at the American University. I was in one place, she was in another place, and our two children were in two different places. I describe what I did that day. I never did this before. That's the nature of this book, and I hope you'll appreciate it. I describe my experiences here in Madrid during the negotiations and later on in Washington. So that's how this book is different from everything that I've ever written before. The book's title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, embodied two specific intentions. One was to describe what has happened in Palestine, not as a war between two peoples, though there are two peoples and they are at war, but as a war on Palestine by Zionism and British imperialism, by Israel and great powers, the United States especially. It is not just a war between Palestinians and Israelis. It was never a war between Palestinians and Israelis alone. It was always a war in which the British Army did the fighting before 1939, in which the United States supplies the weapons. $3.8 billion worth of weapons free to Israel every single year. When they bombed Beirut, they bombed it with Skyhawks, A-4 Skyhawks. They bombed it with Phantoms, American fighter bombers. When they bombarded it with artillery, it was 175 millimeter American artillery and 155 millimeter American artillery. The United States was making war, not just Israel. And that's what I'm trying to highlight by using the title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. I'm trying to show that this is a series of events that started with what the British said in 1917, what Lord Balfour said in the Balfour Declaration, not with the first Zionist Congress or Herzl's book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. It starts as a war. It starts in the terms and in the nature that we know it today in 1917, when Britain occupies Palestine and issues a declaration in which it declares there's one people in Palestine, the Jewish people. There's one group in Palestine that has national rights, the Jewish people. The Palestinians are never mentioned in the Balfour Declaration. The Palestinians are never mentioned in the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, under which Britain governed Palestine until 1948. This was a war on Palestine waged in the first instance by Britain and the League of Nations, as well as by the Zionist movement. And that's what I'm trying to show through this title and through the way in which I argue in this book. And I start in 1917 for that reason. I want to show that when Britain occupies Palestine and issues the Balfour Declaration, that's when the war begins. And it's the British who make the declaration of war. It's not Herzl or Chaim Weizmann. It's Lord Balfour, the British cabinet, and the League of Nations who declare war on the Palestinians. And it's the British who fight that war from 1917 until 1939. It's the British Army that represses the Palestinians. In 1920, there's a rising. The British suppress it. 1921, the British suppress another rising. 1929, the British suppress yet another rising. And in 1936 until 1939, the entire Palestinian people rises up in a revolt. The British, there's about 1 million, 1.2 million Palestinians. Most of them are children. So there are about 400, 300,000 adult males. The British bring in 100,000 soldiers to fight 300,000 Palestinians. Okay, one soldier for every 3 people. 14 to 17% of the adult male Arab population of Palestine are killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled by the British between 36 and 39. It's not the Zionists who do that. They serve as militias, armed and trained and organized by the British. But the British Army, the Royal Air Force, they bomb. They blow up the houses. They shoot the prisoners. They torture. It's the British who waged the war. They declared the war and they waged the war. It's vital to understand this. Zionism never stood alone, nor under the British mandate, nor when the mandate, when the resolution to partition Palestine was passed in 1947, nor ever since Israel was established. And that's what I'm trying to show with this title. I also wanted to shatter an impression that the corporate mass media, especially in the United States, but I think to some extent also in Europe, spreads, which is that there's some kind of equivalence between Palestinians and Israelis. This is a war between two peoples. It's sort of like Germany and France. No. No, there are two peoples, and there's a war between them. But there's, first of all, there's all of this outside support for one side. And secondly, there's no equivalence between colonizer and colonized. When the French fight the Algerians, it's not an equal battle. It's not France and Germany. It's a colonizer and a colonized. It's a victimizer and a victimized. It's an occupier and an occupied. That's what is happening and has always happened in Palestine. So when the media says the Palestinians and the Israelis, they pretend that it's just like, you know, the Napoleonic Wars, you know, the English and the French. No, 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 no. Palestinians have never had a state, never been allowed self-determination. You have the most powerful state in the Middle East, a nuclear power that has bombed 7 Arab capitals, from Tunis to Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, Amman, and Sudan, Khartoum, and on and on and on. This is a great power, a regional great power, fighting a people that has no army, fighting a people that has never enjoyed self-determination. There's no equality. There's no equivalence. And that's another thing I'm trying to show with this book. A framework that I use in this book, it's in the subtitle of the English version. It's not. Colonialism doesn't encapsulate what the term settler colonialism explains. Colonialism is what you did in, what Spain did. Some of you may not have been alive when Spain did this in Morocco, or what the French did in Algeria, or what the British did in Egypt. That's colonialism. Colonial power comes in, it rules over a territory. Eventually there's decolonization. The colonial power leaves. The colonized country achieves independence. Settler colonialism is fundamentally different. A European country, they're always European countries, introduces its white European population into a non-European country to replace and take over the land, or as much as possible of the land and resources, of the indigenous population, either subjugating them or, if possible, in some cases, exterminating them. North America, Australia, New Zealand, more extermination than just subjugation. Algeria, Kenya, South Africa, more subjugation, Libya, Algeria, more subjugation, but also, in Libya, for example, extermination of a large part of the population. Settler colonialism is fundamentally different from ordinary colonialism. And I think it's essential to reframe events in Palestine, to use a different perspective on events in Palestine in terms of this reality, rather than the fiction that this is just a conflict between two national movements. Yes, Zionism is a national movement. It's a settler colonial project, but it's also a national movement. And the Palestinians have a national movement as well. But that's not all it is. It is also a settler colonial war. I think it's important to stress that this is not a unique situation where a settler colonial project develops into a national entity. I am a citizen, here's the passport. I am a citizen of a state which developed from a settler colonial project into a national project. There is an American people, there's an American nation, which has subjugated and in large part destroyed the indigenous population of what is today the United States. There's no contradiction between the national nature of the United States and the settler colonial nature of the United States, or of Canada, or of Australia, or of Israel. And it's vitally important to understand these realities. This is one of the things I try and do with the subtitle of the book and with the phrasing of the book. Another term that's in the Spanish, resistencia, resistance, is absolutely vital. Every colonial power, whether a settler colonial project or a traditional colonial project, has always, always been met by the resistance of the colonized. Always, in every time, in every place, throughout history, invariably, everywhere, always this happens. This is what happens in Palestine. This is what happened in Egypt. This is what happened in Morocco. In Morocco in 1925-26, France and Spain had to send hundreds of thousands of troops to put down the rebellion in the Rif. Hundreds of thousands of troops. Bigger territory, more people than Palestine. The British had to send 100,000 troops to Palestine in 1936-37. It's natural and it's normal that colonized people resist. And always, the colonizer does not charitably describe that resistance. The colonizer never dignifies the resistance of a native people, of an indigenous population to colonialism by saying they're bravely resisting our attempt to subjugate them. No. What they say is these are criminals. The British in Ireland never talked about Irish resistance, criminality. When Margaret Thatcher was starving to death the IR prisoners in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, she described them. She said, these are not freedom fighters. These are criminals. Colonialism always uses the same terms. Sometimes in India they called them bandits. Sometimes they call them barbarians. Sometimes they call them savages. Today the term of art is terrorists. So the Palestinians are not resisting Israel. The Palestinians are carrying out terrorism against Israel. They don't call us criminals. They don't call us barbarians. Some of them call us barbarians and savages. But mainly the term of art is terrorists. Every colonizer is fighting a discursive war, a war of terminology against the colonized. And that's what Israel does. And it has been very successful with this war. You have groups categorized as terrorists by the EU and terrorists by... They govern people. They provide social services. They make war. They kill people. Sometimes they violate international law. Sometimes they carry out acts that are illegal under international law. But then, excuse me, don't China and Russia and the United States and other countries also carry out acts that are violations of international law? In Iraq, in Ukraine? Why are those somehow different from what Palestinian resistance movements do? Any killing of a civilian in certain circumstances is a violation of international law. Can be seen as a criminal act, as a war crime. But when you count the number of civilians killed in Palestine and you count the number of civilians killed in Israel, there's no equivalence. 3 to 4 to 5 times as many Palestinians have been killed, civilians, women, children, and old men, and disabled people, have been killed by Israel than Israeli women, children, and other innocent civilians. Both are war crimes in most circumstances. There are other measures of the legality of that, proportionality, and so on and so forth. But some are described as the Israeli Air Force is a terrorist. I mean, my children were terrorized by the Israeli Air Force in 1982. My children were, my 2 daughters, were traumatized by the Israeli Air Force. Those were war crimes. They killed 17,000 people in Lebanon in 1982, mostly Lebanese, many Palestinians. Some of them were fighters. That was war. Some of them, most of them, the overwhelming majority, were civilians. Nobody took Sharon to the International Criminal Court. Nobody took the Israeli generals to the International Criminal Court. So, what I'm trying to do with this book is to unpack all of these things, to show that these terms that are used have importance, have weight. I do this, and I try where I can in the book, especially in describing the settler colonial nature of the Zionist project from the beginning to today, by citing Zionist leaders. Now, if I wrote the book in 2023, I would have a rich field in the current Israeli government to work from. I would have Ben Gvir and I would have Smotrich, who have no inhibitions, who have no shame, who say exactly what they believe, who talk with honesty and with forthrightness about Jewish power, Jewish supremacy, wiping out villages. These are terms that they use. Ben Gurion should have finished the job in 1948. Smotrich said that to an Arab member of Knesset, in the Knesset, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. He said, Ben Gurion should have finished the job. The Nakba wasn't completed, is what he was saying. He should have completed it. He should have kicked all of you out. That's a member, that's not a member of the government. That's the finance minister speaking. One of the top 3, 4 ministers in the Israeli government. If I wrote the book today, I would quote Smotrich. Instead, I quote the ideological godfather of Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert and Yitzhak Shamir and Menachem Begin, the founder of a trend of Zionism which later became the Likud party. Benjamin Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion Netanyahu, was the personal secretary of the man I'm about to quote, Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, which has come to full flower in the current Israeli government, with people like Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben Gvir, and many, many other stars. What did Jabotinsky say? Jabotinsky was an honest man. I mean, you may like him or dislike him. You may consider him whatever you may consider him. But he was an honest man. He said, every native population in the world resists colonists, as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs of Palestine are doing. Resists colonists. They are resisting colonization. I didn't say that. Vladimir Jabotinsky, whom Netanyahu's father was personal secretary to, said that. And he went on to say, that is what the Arabs of Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing, as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent, listen to the next words, that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. He didn't say the transformation of a part of Palestine, which we want to share with our brothers, the Arabs. He said the transformation of Palestine, all of it, into the land of Israel. This is an honest man. This is not a Weizmann or a Ben Gurion, a diplomat, someone who speaks with forked tongue, who says some things to one group. This is a man who was speaking honestly to his own people, but it was published in Russian. He didn't care if other people read it. And I stress these terms, colonists, resistance, transformation of the entirety of Palestine. Not because he's operating in isolation, because he's the father of the ideological trend which has dominated Israel since 1977. Likud has been in almost every government since 1977. Netanyahu's party is the Likud party. He's the lead member of the coalition that governs Israel today. And he's been Prime Minister of Israel on and off since 1997. These are the words of his mentor, of his ideological guide. And you can see where this leads you to when you look at the law that was passed by the Israeli Knesset in 2018, the Israel Nation-State of the Jewish People law, which says only the Jewish people has the right of self-determination in the land of Israel. Now, how can anybody claim, if this is the constitution of the state of Israel, it's a law with constitutional force. Israel doesn't have a formal constitution. They have laws that have constitutional force. This law is described as a constitutional law. If the Constitution of Israel says there's no Arab people, there's no Palestinian people, only one people has the right of self-determination, how can people blather and talk meaninglessly about a two-state solution? Or that the problem is there's nobody to negotiate with. Well, that's true in the sense that there's nobody to negotiate with on the Israeli side, because the Israeli side has made a constitution which says there's only one state and one people in the land of Israel. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the Israeli Knesset, including most members of the opposition voted for this law. So Jabotinsky is not someone crying in the wilderness. Jabotinsky represents the mainstream of Israel today. He was in a minority in 1923 when he wrote that article. You had labor Zionists who never said the truth about their objectives for decades. But Jabotinsky was telling the truth. I was going to read you another quote from Jabotinsky. He's my favorite Zionist. He represents the spirit, I think, of the Zionist project better than anybody else. Let me conclude by talking very briefly about the different chapters of the book. Actually, Christina laid them out pretty well, so I'm not going to go in any depth into most of the chapters of the book. But I think it's important to stress a couple of things about one or two of the chapters of this book. I describe these 6 chapters in terms of declarations of war. And by and large, these are not declarations of war by Israel. By and large, these are declarations of war by the League of Nations and Britain, by the United States and the Soviet Union and the United Nations in 1947, by the UN Security Council in 1967, meaning Ambassador Goldberg, President Johnson, Secretary of State Rusk. Those are the guys who really wrote. Lord Caradon wrote the resolution But it was an American-Israeli resolution. Abba Eban and the Americans really put the ideas behind it. This is the third declaration of war. The fourth declaration of war is the invasion of Lebanon, the siege of Beirut, the killing of 17,000 people, most of them civilians, and finally, the Sabra and Shatila massacres. The fifth declaration of war is what happened in Oslo in 1993. This is an American-Israeli framework. I was involved in negotiations before Oslo. And we learned very early on in the negotiations what the ceiling was and who constructed that ceiling. The ceiling was about 3 inches, 10 centimeters above the floor. There was to be no discussion of statehood, no discussion of sovereignty, no discussion of Jerusalem, no discussion of refugees, no discussion of borders, no discussion of water, no discussion of security. All of these things were deferred to what was called final status. But Secretary Baker, who knew how to put pressure on the Israeli government, and he insisted that neither side should take actions that would prejudice or otherwise determine the outcome. In other words, there were not supposed to be any unilateral moves by either side. And when the Rabin government came into power in 1992, and the Israeli government continued settlement of the occupied territories, we went to the Americans and we said to them, we're supposed to be negotiating the division of this land into 2 states. But the Israelis are colonizing, continuing the colonization in the occupied territories. We're dividing a pizza up and they're eating the pizza while we're negotiating how to cut it up. And the Americans said, yes, well, it's very serious. And they did nothing. And we went back to them and he said, you wrote these ground rules. These were supposed to determine the nature of the negotiation. No, nothing. At that point, given that very low ceiling, given the exclusion of everything important from the negotiations, we began to realize that this was a process that was not intended to lead to self-determination, statehood, end of occupation, and a reversal of the colonization process. What we see in Oslo is a structure that in fact has reinforced the occupation, made it much, much more severe and much harsher than it was before 1993. A process that has led to the growth in the number of illegal Israeli settlers from under 200,000 to over 700,000 today. And a process that has led to the creation of a security force in the Palestinian Authority, which essentially serves to protect the occupation, protect the settlements, and protect Israeli civilians. That's the outcome of Oslo. So I describe that as a 6th declaration of war, even though it was, to my eternal regret, signed by the PLO leadership. I want to say a couple more words about how we might have a solution. I could talk about each of the chapters, but I'll leave that for questions if any of you have questions. I could talk about the Balfour Declaration until tomorrow, or about UN Security Council Resolution 242, or about the partition resolution, or about the negotiations. But I'll leave that for questions if anybody's interested. There is no, unfortunately, because it would be a wonderful thing if there could be peace in Palestine, there's no likelihood of a resolution in the near future. There's no likelihood because, first of all, Israel is completely intransigent. Israeli government since Rabin in 1995, just before he was murdered, have clearly stated that they will not accept an independent, sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state. Rabin said that in the Knesset, and they killed him a few weeks later because he had already gone too far as the settlers. The people who now control the Israeli government were not in control in those days, but they killed him. However, he had already said, I will never allow a Palestinian state. So that's why there are not going to be any negotiations until Israel changes or is forced to change that position. There's nothing to negotiate. I mean, you can negotiate capitulation and surrender and acceptance of whatever terms they deign to permit you, but that's not a negotiation. That's Versailles. And that's what Edward Said called Oslo, Versailles, a Palestinian Versailles. The second reason that there's no possibility of negotiations today is because the Palestinian national movement is in a state of complete disarray. It's divided, it's weak, it's unrepresentative and undemocratic. The last elections were in 2006, 17 years ago. Neither of these leaderships, nor in Ramallah nor in or in Gaza, represent anybody but themselves and the people who give them money from outside, the external powers that support this situation. Until the Palestinians are unified, until they have reunified their national movement, until they have a clear strategy. The people in Gaza and the leaderships in Gaza and in Ramallah are not just not unified. They're intellectually bankrupt. They have no ideas on how to change the status quo. They're not resisting, and they're not negotiating. They're not involved in even civil disobedience. They're not involved in even nonviolent resistance. They're not even supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They're not supporting solidarity. They're doing nothing to liberate Palestine. And so until that situation changes, obviously, there's no possibility of a negotiation. Back in the 60s and 70s, the Palestinians had a unified national movement. Whether their strategy was good or bad is another issue, but there was a unified Palestinian national movement with a clear set of objectives, and which achieved a number of things, positive things, and also had a number of failures. We don't have that today in Palestine. We don't have a unified national movement with a clear strategy that's appropriate to 2023, not to 1972 or 1965. That's appropriate to the situation in Palestine today. Finally, there's no possibility of a negotiation because there's no forum for negotiation. The idea of the United States as a mediator, a party to the war, a party that gives Israel the bombs and the guns and the artillery and the planes to kill Palestinians, as a mediator, is obscene. I mean, we figured that out in Madrid and Washington. And one would have hoped other people had figured it out by now. And finding an alternative to the United States is not going to be easy. The United States is the greatest superpower in modern history. It may no longer dominate the world the way it did after the Cold War, but it's still a great power in the Middle East. And it will have to be in the negotiations. But my proposal is that the Israelis and the Americans sit on the same side of the table, and the Palestinians on the other side of the table, and somebody else sits in the middle. I wouldn't say anybody else, but almost anybody else. That forum has yet to be devised, and that structure has yet to be devised. So there's not going to be a solution. When and if a solution is possible, it will have to be based on equality of rights for both peoples and for all individuals of both peoples. Human rights, political rights, civil rights, religious rights, property rights, and national rights. Israel is a settler colonial project, but there has developed a people, and they have national rights. يعني شئت أو أم أبيت. يعني you like it or you don't like it. It's a fact. And there are some Palestinians who still cannot accept that fact. The Palestinians, for all of their history of dispersal and all of their history of division, are people. Whether the Israelis like it or not, they have to accept it. And peoples have national rights in the modern world. And that has to be part of the solution. But individuals have individual rights. No individual and no group can exercise their rights at the expense of the other in a solution that is just and lasting. And there has to be a just and lasting solution. Thank you very much.
Well, now the floor is open, but let me give the privilege of asking the first question to Cristina, if you want. Otherwise, we go directly to the public.
Okay.
You can ask in Spanish or Catalan.
Sorry. No, sorry, I'm lost. ¿Cuál es... la meva pregunta és si... sorry, my question is if there is any reason for hope for the Palestinians today?
Yes, there are many reasons for hope. The first reason is the younger generation. The younger generation I would say that if I were to give a talk a little bit like this, I gave a talk in Haifa 3 weeks ago, and most of the people there were not younger generation. But people agree with me. And when I speak at Palestinian universities, people agree with me. All of the things I said at the end, people agree with me. The younger generation is smart, and it understands how bankrupt the leadership is today. It understands that there has to be a different strategy. And
you mean younger generation?
of Palestinians.
Of Palestinians.
Sorry, thank you. I mean the younger generation of Palestinians. So that's one reason for hope. They are utterly dissatisfied with the status quo. And you asked me a question earlier when we were talking. Ben-Gurion said the old will die and the young will forget. Well, the old have died. It happens. But the young have not forgotten. The young are more militant than their grandparents, much more militant. And they're smarter. They're better informed. They understand the world much better. Palestinian Americans understand how the United States works. That's why they win boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolutions on American college campus. They do it together with Jewish students and minority students and others. They have alliances. It's not just Palestinians or Arab students. So I have enormous optimism because of that. Second reason I'm optimistic is that it's very, very clear that an important change is happening in the United States. The United States was always the bulwark of Zionism. You know, the British did the dirty work. The British killed Palestinians, but the money came from the United States, from contributions, not from the U.S. government. Also now more from the U.S. government. The weapons come from the U.S. government. But the support for Israel was always rooted in domestic support in the United States. And Israel still has enormous support. The entire Republican Party is supportive of Israel, for reasons that have very little to do with Zionism or Jewish voters or contributions from AIPAC and other members of the Israel lobby. Have to do with Christian evangelicalism and other things. So Israel still has support. But for the first time in the United States, you have a majority party, the Democratic Party, which is moving very rapidly. And this is, I've never seen anything like this. And I was born in New York in 1948. You couldn't find a book on Palestine in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. They weren't published. Every day I get a new novel. Every day I get a new play. Every day I get a new memoir. Every day I get a new academic book on Palestine. Our students know about Palestine. Students anywhere that they study this, including in places where there are no Palestinian professors, are learning much more about the real history than was ever possible before. And so this makes me optimistic, not in the short term. American politics won't change soon. American policy won't change soon. But this is another, in my view, reason for optimism. The last reason, and you have to understand, this is optimism of the long term. This is not optimism of 2025 or 2026. So as far as politicians are concerned, the next election is the future. 2024 in the United States, that's the horizon. Nothing after 2024 exists for any American politician, except senators who will be elected and re-elected in 2026. But aside from that. But if you think in the long term, the third reason for optimism is I think something is happening in the Middle East. Two things are happening in the Middle East that are reasons for cautious optimism. One of them is a decoupling of the major countries in the Middle East from their relationship, their former relationship with the United States. The United States is no longer the sole axis of power in the Middle East. And you see this with every major Middle Eastern country. Many of them are still very dependent on the Middle East, especially because many of them are non-democratic, autocratic police state regimes that lack legitimacy domestically, that don't have elections, and they need external support. Even so, look at Turkey, look at Israel, look at Egypt, look at Saudi Arabia. These are countries that do exactly as they please and ignore the United States on matters of vital national interest. The United States does not want oil prices higher. Saudi Arabia is an ally of Russia in raising oil prices. They don't care. The United States has a deep, visceral hostility to Iran and an almost more visceral hostility to China. Iran and Saudi Arabia negotiated a normalization of relations via China. The two bêtes noires of the United States, the Saudis gladly approached and are dealing with. The ambassadors have now been exchanged. Flights have begun. Pilgrims are going back and forth. The Iranian deputy foreign minister made a statement. I mean, it was dripping with honey about the Saudis being so generous in evacuating our citizens from Sudan. Thank you so much. We're deeply grateful. I mean, the two countries have normalized relations thanks to China in opposition to American wishes. And you can go country by country. The Egyptians are selling Russia secretly weapons for their war in Ukraine. Israel doesn't do what the Americans want all the time. Turkey doesn't do what the Americans want all the time. This wasn't the case in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, or even after the Cold War. Now, I don't have much sympathy with any of the governments I've just described, nor Iran, nor Saudi Arabia, nor Egypt, nor Turkey. You know, I'm not Israel, certainly not Israel. But we're talking about a different kind of beginning, in the Middle East at least, of a different world than the unipolar world that emerged from the Cold War. And by the way, Baker and Bush were operating at that very turning point in Madrid in 1993. That turning point has turned again. I don't know where it's going. I'm a historian. I don't predict the future. I don't know. But what I see today is a cause for some cautious optimism. And the other cause for cautious optimism is that the Arab peoples haven't accepted the dictatorships that have been imposed upon them. They rose up in 2010 and 2011 and 2012. They were repressed. But they'll rise up again, sooner or later. Maybe very much later, maybe sooner than we realize. And that may be true for the Palestinians as well. So all of those are causes for optimism.
Thank you. Sorry.
I think wait for the microphone.
Sí, per la traducció és important.
Okay. Good evening. Just a question. Is it possible to do anything related to the Palestinian cause without dealing anything with the Arab dictatorships? And one more reason, or one more question about the media nowadays. If there is anything between Palestinians or Israelis in many countries, or in many, like European, or even in Spain, it's called always by name of like Jihad or Hamas. So what's the effect, or what's the impact of this on the Palestinian cause as like an international cause in terms of colonialization?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the second question, but I'll try and answer it. Yes, the Arab dictatorships are a barrier to the liberation of Palestine. One of the greatest assets that Israel has is the undemocratic nature of much of the Arab world. It enables them to claim that they're the only democracy in the Middle East. A country that rules over 5 million people under military law is not a democracy, and it's done that for 56 years. And what kind of democracy is it? Where a population almost equal to your population lives with no rights. It's not a democracy. It's a democracy for Israeli Jews, and it's a limited democracy for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And it is a military dictatorship for 5 million Palestinians. It's not a democracy. But they are able to peddle that because in the Arab world you have authoritarian police state regimes with 3 or 2 or 4, depends on how you count them, exceptions, from the Atlantic to the Gulf. Now, does that obstruct solidarity with the Palestinians? Of course it does. But I think you should take heart from the polls that are done by the Arab Center in Qatar of public opinion in the Arab world. They poll 11 or 12 countries. Public opinion is as supportive of the Palestinians in 2023 as it has ever been. If the PLO understood that and it reached over the heads of the grandfathers of the current kings and dictators, so it was Sadat before Sisi, and it was King Fahd before King Salman. But it's the same regimes, same military in Egypt, the same royal family in Saudi Arabia. They reached over the heads of those regimes to public opinion. That's possible. That can be done. And that forces these regimes to limit their sabotage of the Palestine cause. And in countries that become fully democratic, countries where there is some free press, countries like Lebanon and countries like Kuwait, public opinion is supportive of the Palestinians, and the governments follow suit because they have to follow public opinion. Even in Saudi Arabia, no elections, no unions, no political parties, no free press. There's public opinion. That's why Saudi Arabia has not normalized with Israel, even though every press report you read says Mohammed bin Salman wants to normalize. Why has he not normalized? Because he's afraid of his own public opinion, or his advisors are smart enough to tell him to be afraid of his own public opinion. So you're right, the Arab dictatorships pose a huge obstacle to the Palestine cause. But it is possible to go over that. The second question about the media. I'm actually optimistic. I could have answered Christina's question with another reason for optimism. I'm optimistic because the mainstream corporate media used to serve as a filter, an Israeli filter, for what most people saw and heard and read about the Middle East, and especially about Palestine. It was a Zionist filter. Most young people don't consume the mainstream corporate media. They consume social media. So they may see this journalist or that interview on MSNBC or on BBC, but they'll see it on Twitter or Instagram or YouTube or whatever. And they pick and choose. And they see much, 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 much more than the poor old people who sit in front of their televisions and watch the corporate mainstream media, or who read the New York Times or the Times of London. Younger people do not depend on the mainstream corporate media. They get some of that in their feeds. And they see much, much more. And the expression, what you've seen cannot be unseen, is why you have this shift. So the media is an obstacle, but also social media. It's bad and it's good. And in this respect, it's actually quite good, I think.
Més preguntes.
I'll try and make my answers shorter.
Yes. Okay, no, well, if you want, we may pick different questions.
I'll take three and I'll
You take note and then
good idea.
You go through it.
Thank you.
Okay, sí, endavant.
Hello, Mr. Rashid. Thank you so much for your lecture. Actually, I'm very happy to see you personally, so because I have seen so many videos and lecture of you. And yeah, actually, my point is, my question leads me. I really appreciate like your personalities, like you and Edward Said. And since you have occupied the chair of Edward Said at Columbia University, I would have loved to ask my question to Edward Said, but you remind me of him. And that's why I ask you my question. So what do you think, like, you know, what you would like to say to younger generation, Palestinian generation, what they can do to make a progress in terms of their fightings against Zionism and Israel, to bring the Palestinian issue more internationally? So which kind of resistance we can adopt as Palestinian as the young Palestinian generation, that we can do, that we can adapt away from violence and armed resistance?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really interested in what do you think about it when, as a historian.
Thank you
so much.
A veure, agafarem alguna pregunta més, si voleu. Aquí, aquest senyor verd d'Esperança.
Les noies, també.
Should I make it now, the question?
Que quan acabis ho passes allí.
Okay. So, first of all, thank you very much for this conference. And I think there should be more and more conferences like this around Europe, just to awaken the Palestinian cause. So my question is very simple, and it's related to what you mentioned earlier about Algeria. I happen to be Algerian, so I know the resistance that was for the French colonialism. And I want to ask my question regarding the support of Palestine. As you know, Algeria has been unconditionally supporting Palestine since the beginning. And my question is, how much Palestine is relying on foreign support for its independence? And I'm not only talking about the Muslim world or the Arabs, but because we all know, for example, that Ireland is also supporting Palestine, but in general, how much Palestine is relying on foreign support for its independence? Thank you.
Tercera pregunta i passarem la veu al ponent.
Thank you so much for coming. It's such an honor having you here in our city. You might have heard that in Barcelona we had a huge win some months ago after a lot of work from a huge coalition formed by very varied civil society organizations. There was a huge collection of over 4,000 signatures. We're asking the Barcelona City Council to end its twinning agreement with Tel Aviv. 2 months ago, the mayor announced a suspension of that twinning and ending Israeli institutional relations. And I wanted to ask what you thought of this. What do you think? If you think it's a good way forward, and also from Barcelona, now that we've had this win, how can we strengthen even more support for the Palestinian cause? Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. What means can the younger generation use for resistance? And you asked about non-violent means. I mean, I honestly think that what Palestinian civil society is doing in terms of calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a very fruitful non-violent approach. The reaction of Zionists in the United States is so fierce and so virulent that we must be doing something right. If this worries them so much, they've established a strategic affairs ministry to fight some students in the United States. We're doing something right. Clearly, and they've said, this is an existential threat. Okay? That means they know that this has a potential. And so, do more. I'm not saying you should do more, but more can and should be done. And given the weakness and the division of the Palestinian national movement, the political structures, it's not surprising that it's Palestinian civil society that's leading this, and it's students that are doing the most work on this. And it is I promise you, having an effect. I know that what was done here in Barcelona was not technically part of a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, though in a sense you could argue it was. You cannot imagine the echo of this in the world. You can maybe think you've seen what the response and the reaction in Spain or in Catalonia or in Barcelona was, but the reaction in the rest of the world was enormous. It really was a shock. This is one of the biggest cities in the world, and Tel Aviv is the biggest city in Israel. And you unplugged that connection. Israel uses what they call brand Israel, selling Israel as a normal country. They want to be part of Eurovision. They want to be in the European soccer. They want tourism. They're an IT nation. They're a startup nation. They're not a violent, oppressive, colonial settler regime. They're not a country that's bombed 7 Arab capitals. They don't want you to see that. And what was done here in Barcelona and what's being done, Belém just adopted something similar today, I heard. I don't know the exact terms of what they did, but it can have a knock-on effect. One thing can lead to another, can lead to another. I was in Washington, and there are new groups in the United States that are working for the first time on Capitol Hill and with journalists. And I heard things in Washington I've never heard before. People talking about stopping tax-free charitable donations to Israeli settler groups. Nobody ever talked about that. A bill to stop American tax dollars going to the imprisonment of Palestinian children. Now, those bills won't be passed, but they force the Israelis to defend the arrest of children, the imprisonment of... They force the Israelis and their supporters to defend the building of settlements with tax-free charitable organizations, American. I pay taxes, so they don't pay taxes, so they can subsidize illegal settlements. The very fact that the bill is put before Congress, in this case before the New York State Senate, is a propaganda win. You put them on the back foot. That's what it's about. We have not won the divestment of one American university from companies that support the occupation. But we've won the students on every single campus where this was, who cares whether they divest? The companies are going to sell weapons anyway. There's a profit there. But the change is among public opinion. Change is not the companies. And that's true on every one of these fronts. And that's why it may seem like it's hard to do these things, but actually, hard though it is, it really has an important effect. I've answered your question, and I've answered the first question. The last question, how much do the Palestinians rely on foreign support? Unfortunately, they have learned that there's very little that they can rely on. in terms of foreign support. Algeria actually has been supportive since the very beginning, since the 60s, actually. And that actually hasn't changed. But what's really necessary is that the Arab countries have some kind of coordinated, unified stand. And that's very hard when you have countries normalizing relations with Israel and basically supporting Israel rather than the Palestinians. So there's a deep division in the Arab world over this. And many, many countries have normal relations with Israel that don't yet have ambassadors in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. So I think the Palestinians certainly don't rely much on support from the Arab governments, but they do, I think, rely on the support of Arab public opinion. And unfortunately, the Palestinian leaderships don't give this issue enough attention. And until they're unified and have a clear strategy, they're not going to, unfortunately. I do think, though, that expressions of solidarity, like what happened in Belém today and what happened in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, are greatly heartening to Palestinians. And I don't think people realize that everybody follows international news in Palestine. I mean, it's a people that's listening to the radio and reading the papers and watching TV and on YouTube and on Instagram and Twitter all the time, and a lot of Facebook too, all the time. So they know, and they're encouraged by it.
Sí, a ver.
Maybe 3 more.
Okay, 3 more.
Somebody back there.
مرحبا دكتور رشيد.
مرحبتين.
We're so happy to have you here, and I just wanted to ask a question that I think comes up a lot in Palestinian circles and among Palestinian intellectuals. Considering that you worked as part of the negotiation team for Oslo and
not for Oslo.
I mean in Madrid.
Before Oslo.
In Madrid, before you, I guess, gave up on it. There are a lot of talk about reforming the PLO, and that we need to reclaim the PLO and that space that unites Palestinians across their fragmented societies. But there are people that are also critical of that, considering that the PLO is such a nation-state-driven organization, and that, for example, Professor Leila Farsakh has made the argument that the nation-state concept is also a colonial concept on its own. So do the Palestinians really need to reform the PLO, or do we need a new framework to work on the unification of the Palestinian project? It's a question that comes up a lot in our work, and I'm curious about your thoughts because you were involved somehow in those discussions.
Gràcies. A veure, segona pregunta, en què farem 3?
Li pots passar tu mateix, si vols.
Sí, poso ella.
La señora.
Sí, sí.
مرحبا مرة ثانية.
مرحبتين. أهلين.
نفسي أحكي بالعربي بس احتراما لا حنحكي بالإنجليزي.
لا بس للجمهور.
أكيد.
معليش.
First of all, I do want to thank you for this specific book because before reading this book in 2021, I never shared my personal story or the personal story of how my grandparents were displaced from Palestine. But after that, in the Palestinian circles, again, we learned how to merge our experiences because before like such books or academic works, we thought that everyone views us as emotional, irrational, especially with claiming Palestine again. But my question would be, you mentioned that we're going to cross paths with Israelis, which we're fully aware of it. Not by negotiating 6% of our land, but disregarding the name of the land, what we're going to agree on. Can we like dive deep more into what kind of Israelis we're going to cross paths with? Because we're not going to simply share our property, land, or go back to the villages that we were displaced from with colonizers, with war criminals, with people who stood at checkpoints, or people who burnt our children alive, and people who are still displacing the rest of our people in Jerusalem or the West Bank. So I think it's really important, especially in this reformation of the Palestinian narrative, because we always talk about the Nakba and before the Nakba, after the Nakba بشوي, but we never talk about the liberation of Palestine. We don't have a unified vision of what is a liberated Palestine is.
Yeah.
So I really would like to hear your insight of like what kind of Israelis would agree to cross paths, because I think it's fair enough that we do not share our property with war criminals, honestly.
Ok, aquesta era la segona. Encara... Aquesta era la segona, no? Well, then I will
That's it.
one myself.
Please.
Of course, there's been much talk, you mentioned it, about the, well, two-state solution that has been accepted now, I don't know, for by the international community for 40 years or something like that. And it's seen, I think, increasingly as made impossible by Israelis themselves. Okay. Yeah. And they are building kind of an apartheid state, part of it under military occupation with no rights, and part of it with limited rights, as you said. But then there are two possible stances, two possible positions. One is to reject and go back to, I don't know, 100 years back. And the other is the one-state solution. A friend of mine said that Israel had a trilemma. Could not be at the same time a democratic, Jewish state, and imperialist, occupying territory with having an apartheid system. So how would you consider, from your point of view, or people who you think may bring things in the right direction, the one-state solution, providing that it is just not a Jewish state, but a democratic state, whatever the name is, Israel, Palestine, or whatever. How do we envision that possibility? Comprising the whole territory, of course, proper Israel, today,
and all of Palestine,
legally, and the territories.
Yeah. Three very hard questions, actually. And these are going to be the last questions.
It is the last.
Thankfully. To reform or replace the PLO? That's a very hard question. I hesitate to tell you what I hesitate to tell you because you'll think, oh, he's thought about this and this is a considered opinion. I have not thought about this, and it's not a considered opinion. So this is just my impression responding to this very, very good question. It may be that the PLO, in its current state of decay, and I can explain that a little bit, cannot be revived. It may be a rotting corpse, not just because it represents a nation-state formula. And I don't think that's as much of a problem as some people think. I mean, Leila is a close friend of mine. She was on the editorial committee of the journal, and I work with her all the time. And I see her point. But unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, we're stuck with nation states. And we have two populations, both of which are fiercely committed to the idea of a state. So you're going to need to do a whole hell of a lot of education, not just with Palestinians, but also with Israelis, if you're going to overcome the idea of the nation state. So you're going to have a some state solution for the foreseeable future. Maybe we'll all melt into some greater Middle Eastern bouillabaisse one day, but that's not going to happen in the 2020s or maybe the 2030s. But there has to be a new unified platform for Palestinian national aspirations. And I have only a couple of suggestions. One is, you cannot have a national leadership inside the occupied territories, meaning all of Palestine. One of the many, 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 many mistakes the PLO leadership made was not leaving the PLO outside. Palestine had not been liberated, and it has not been liberated. Why they left, all of them left, Tunis and Yemen and wherever they rushed to Palestine, where they walked voluntarily into a cage that the Israelis locked. A minister cannot move from Ramallah to Nablus without their permission. You can't enter the country or leave it without their permission. And they exercise this power quite callously. So whatever movement there is, it will have to be based outside and connected to inside, obviously. But that was the case before Oslo, before '95, when they all returned. Some of them could have returned. I'm not saying people shouldn't return, but the entire leadership puts itself voluntarily into prison? What were they thinking? And I argued with them. Nobody listened to me. You asked I don't see where you are. You asked a very good question. What kind of Israelis? And I'll say two things. Fortunately, or unfortunately, but fortunately for your question, there's not going to be a solution very soon. There's going to have to be profound change in Israel before Israel gives up its dreams of hegemony and domination and complete control and Judaization. There's going to have to be a complete change. Israel's going to have to be put under forms of pressure that are inconceivable today. I don't think they're going to be military forms, personally. I don't think that's where it's going to come from. Israel, if you believe the analysis that it is a settler colonial project, then this is the metropole. Here in New York, Barcelona, Madrid, Paris, London, New York, Washington. That's the metropole. When the metropole changes, the colony changes. That's what happened in South Africa. Why did it change? Because the metropole said, we cannot afford this anymore. It doesn't work for us anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore. Apartheid is a bad thing. Now, they still wanted their profits. Shell is still there. Shell fought apartheid, and then one day Shell Oil, the corporation, changed. Reagan supported apartheid vigorously, and then the American government changed. So that will be one of many points of pressure. And so we're not talking, and that's going to take a long time. I'm sorry. I hate to say it. You will maybe see it. I doubt my generation, most of us will see it. In that time, there's going to have to be profound change among Palestinians, but also among Israelis. And the second thing I say to you is, think of other situations where occupation and even where settler colonial regimes have been transformed. Think of situations where dictatorships have been transformed. Some of them involve bringing war criminals to justice. And some of them involve accepting that if there is admission of guilt, as it happened in South Africa and in some of the countries of Latin America, Chile, Argentina, where they had war criminals, people who threw prisoners bound from airplanes and helicopters into the sea. Some of those people were tried, and many of them, they achieved a pardon because they admitted what they'd done. The torturers of the South African regime, most of them did not go to jail. The policemen who killed people in them, most of them did not go to jail. Now, if you want absolute justice, I'm afraid you're going to have to liberate Palestine yourself with guns. And I don't think that's going to happen. You know, if you want every war criminal to be put in the dock, which is, you know, ideally the case. But remember, if you're talking about war crimes, you're talking about international law. Anybody who kills civilians, and that doesn't just mean the Israelis who killed 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 12 times as many Palestinian civilians. It also means the Palestinians who killed Israeli civilians under law, under international, would be considered war criminals. And they, if what's sauce for the goose, American English expression, is sauce for the gander. Now, there are a lot more geese in Israel than there are ganders in Palestine, but still, that means the leaders of many Palestinian movements would be brought to justice and tried for the killing of innocent civilians. So, and that maybe should happen with some people. So I'm not saying that's out of the, but truth and reconciliation processes, which can be flawed and can be faulty and can be painful for the victims, may be the only way to reconcile this. In our situation, every South African I've ever talked to has said to me, you don't know how much worse Palestine is than South Africa ever was. What the Israelis have done is much worse than apartheid. Much worse than apartheid. So I sympathize with the desire for absolute justice, but I don't think you can have a settlement with absolute. The other thing to say is, you win by dividing your enemy. You cannot say, the only people I will talk to are the people who agree with me 100%. I will never have a coalition with anybody who has one drop of Zionist ideology in their brain. You cannot win that way. They divide us. They divide us and divide us, and we unify them by refusing to speak or refusing to have coalitions on certain issues with certain people who are still Zionists. In the United States, for example, you have a group like Jewish Voice for Peace, which is anti-Zionist. Fine, easy to cooperate with them. You have groups like Not in Our Name, completely anti-Zionist, easy to cooperate with them. But there are other groups that are harshly critical of Israel, but which are Zionist. On some issues, it's absolutely necessary to have a tactical alliance with them. I don't agree with them, I don't like them, I don't believe in them, but I've watched as many people moved from hard Zionism to soft Zionism to non-Zionism to anti-Zionism. And it's the only way that you will ever change Israel. You have to change them. They're not going anywhere. Some of them may leave. The good ones, many of the good ones are leaving. I have so many Israeli colleagues. They'll never go back because they can't stand having their children serve in an army of occupation, or they can't stand having the rabbis control their lives. And they may do it for the wrong reasons or the right reasons. That they left. And the people who are going are the worst kinds. And that's going to be very hard to deal with them. You talk about war criminals. I would talk about the people in the settlements. I mean, that's the hardest. They're the ones who actually have stolen or are on our stolen land. It's true. Most of the country is stolen. I mean, my grandparents' house is in Jaffa. It's not in the occupied territories. That's another issue, though. And there are people like Salman Abu Sitta who say everybody can return, which I think is true, actually. But you could also rebuild Palestine as it was before 1940. I think that's a pipe dream. And I think that's idiotic, frankly. I'm not criticizing him. He's a wonderful, great thinker and a wonderful person. But Palestinians are an urban population today. They weren't in 1948. So is every population of every Arab country. The overwhelming majority of most people in most Arab countries, all Arab countries, is urban. They used to be rural. They used to be farmers. They're now workers in service industries and so on and so forth. And that's what Palestine is going to be in the 21st century. It's not going to be 450 or 500 villages rebuilt. No, that's not going to happen. So it's not really only a question of my home village or my own property. It's a question of a people returning to its country and regaining its rights. And at the same time figuring out a way to live with people who've oppressed them now for generations and generations. Not easy, I understand. But I leave the problem to you because it's not going to be solved in my lifetime. Hardest question. I agree with the premise of your question, which is that Israel has systematically prevented the possibility of a two-state solution ever since the Eshkol government in 1967 began the building of settlements. That was the objective. There will never be a Palestinian state. And I mean, it's possible to reverse that, but I don't think it's likely. So one way or another, I just said in response to this question that I don't think we can go back to the past. It's not possible. I don't think it's even desirable. Most people don't want to live in villages anyway. Nobody does anymore. Some do, but most don't, and they leave. I mean, we have a house in a village in France. Most people don't live there. They come back from Lyon, they come back from Paris in the summer. They live somewhere else, but they still have a connection to their village. And that's the way it's going to be in Palestine. However, I do think that talking prematurely about the specific nature of the future arrangement, a one-state solution, a federal solution, a cantonal solution, a binational solution, is probably misguided. I think we have many steps before we get to the specific structure of a solution. And I think that the young woman's question here explains why. I mean, how are you going to live with people who've been treating you as if you don't exist for their whole lives? That whole mindset has to change. So we're quite a ways away from that. I personally am not a big fan of states, nation states. I mean, but I'm also a historian. And not only do they exist, but as Benedict Anderson, great anthropologist, now dead. He wrote the best book on nationalism. He was a communist, and he believed in the disappearance of nation states. And when Vietnam and China went to war, he said, oh my God, nation states are here whatever you think, even in communist states. And so he wrote this book on nationalism. And so we live in an era of nation states, and that's true for Palestinians and Israelis. The Zionist dream was not a return. It was not an existence. It was a state. The book says, der Judenstaat. And that's what the Palestinians have been demanding: self-determination, independence, statehood. And that's become an aspiration of generation after generation on both sides. So I'm afraid you're going to have to figure out a future in which involves states. Now, what kind of state or states? I don't know. I think you can devise something along the lines of Swiss or Belgian or binational or even multinational state, which has ways in which people exercise national rights, but not at the expense of every individual's rights. How you do that, I don't know. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not a student of Belgian or of Swiss history, but I think it probably could be made possible. How and what, but not now. It's not going to happen now. Don't worry. Not in the future, not in the near future. One day, maybe soon, I hope, but not too soon, probably. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Oh, yes.
Bé, moltes gràcies a tots per la seva assistència, pel seu interès i per les preguntes interessants que hi ha hagut.
Cal recordar que dissabte a les 6 de la tarda a la plaça Universitat hi ha una manifestació